Hey everybody, welcome back to Holy Roast Podcast. This is Rob and
Rachel.
And we are finally back. After a few months hiatus, we've had holidays, we've had ice, we've had
snow
and sickness.
And more snow.
And probably some more sickness. And it probably has emulated your own household or churches. And but we're finally back. But I hope you've taken some time to go back and to listen to some of our other fantastic guests. I mean, we've had some really rock star guests.
We have.
And who would want to sit down with us? I'm always amazed by. But I'm glad they're here for you and not for us. And today we have a very special guest from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. We have the Dr. Perzavia Praylow over here. Welcome, Dr. Praylow.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to join the podcast and to be in conversation with the both of you this morning. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, we're so excited for this. And I think y'all are going to really enjoy this conversation and hope that it becomes not only beneficial for yourself, but share it with your churches and outside and all the wonderful things happening at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, just right down the road from where we record this episode. So, Dr. Praylow, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you come from, some of your call story, and then what your role is?
We could talk all day just about the journey of the call story, but I'll begin by saying that my name is Perzavia Praylow. I am originally from Jersey City, New Jersey, and from Jersey City, New Jersey, all the way to Louisville, Kentucky. It has been a impactful call story of saying yes to God. But I began my journey of education actually at a Methodist affiliated undergrad, Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, where I fell in love with African American history. I remember my first course in history that I took at Drew. It was called African American History from Reconstruction to the Present. I didn't know then that one course would have such an impact on my own journey. What was very impactful as a student at Drew is that Drew United Methodist Seminary was also there. So I spent a lot of time in a building called Seminary Hall, and I had the opportunity to interact with a lot of seminarians. But fast forward, I did my PhD studies at the University of Illinois. And while I was studying at the University of Illinois, I was very active in a local church called the Church of the Living God. And that congregation was the space where I began to raise a question that God had within my heart. And that is, how could I use my studies, my research, my interest in African American social history, particularly chronicling the African American pursuit of freedom and equality. How could I use that to be of service to God wherever God would send me? And so my career and my journey has, in many respects, been part of the local church and also been part of the academy. In many respects, I've also thought about, well, what's the practical application of history? And so I've always believed as a teacher, not just as a scholar and theologian, but as an educator, that my journey has been called to provide a pathway to learning about the cultures and histories and experiences of other people. Sometimes we fear what we don't know. And so I believe that history is an important tool, an important journey through which we can learn about the histories and lived experiences of other people, so that we can learn that when we are advocating for justice, we can learn the importance of making sure that everyone has access to the same table. So my journey has taken me many places. But most recently, after having taught for a couple of years at Augusta State University, I went to Columbia Theological Seminary and became deeply impassioned about the thriving of African American congregations within the Presbyterian Church USA. So pastored a small rural church in Winsboro, South Carolina called Calvary Presbyterian Church right outside of seminary, and also did some experiences in chaplaincy. But education and faith for me has always been two sides of the same coin. When I received the call to pastor 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., the first predominant and oldest African-American Presbyterian congregation in Washington, D.C. I also received the call to be director of contextual theology at Howard Divinity School. So all of these experiences began to shape my call to serve God, but it really began as an undergrad, as a first-year college student who was deeply impassioned about learning about the story of racial justice in American society. I never dreamed that after taking one course with Lily Johnson Edwards, my history professor, who's actually United Methodist, by the way.
There we go.
That my journey would take me from teaching in state public institutions to historically black colleges and universities, and then arriving at Columbia Theological Seminary. My first year of teaching, I was also enrolled as a seminary student, and I didn't know what God would do. I had already committed this journey to becoming a college professor, but then I found myself in seminary, and I always envisioned that I would have a life of scholarship and a life of the mind. But I arrived at Columbia Seminary, and I didn't know what God would do, and ultimately became ordained as a Presbyterian pastor. But I was also very deeply impassioned about learning the witness. One of the first books I picked up at Columbia was Gaylord Wilmore's Black and Presbyterian. And so I began to learn more about liberation theology and the witness of African-American Presbyterians. And ultimately, my journey took me to pastor in Washington, D.C., and then this amazing opportunity came open in Louisville, Kentucky, and that is serving as the director of Black Church Studies and assistant professor of historical theology. So in many respects, my journey has come full circle from taking that first course many, many years ago as a student in African-American history. And my current role is to continue the development of Black Church Studies program at Louisville Seminary, but it is also to introduce students who are not just of African descent to the shared witness and the story of African-American congregations near and far, but to really think about the ways in which learning about the witness, the Christian witness of the Black church can be a impactful resource to all of us as we're navigating questions of Christian mission and justice as well. So long way of answering a little bit about my call story. Thank you for the question.
I love that. Part of that, you said, and I want to go back to this just for a moment.
Sure.
Is for you and your call story, that kind of faith and education with two sides of the same coin, right?
Absolutely.
Can you tell me more about that? Because I love that intertwining as a part of your story. And I think many of the professors I had in seminary had that same balance.
Yes.
And I found that to be so helpful to my own as one called to the pastorate, to have somebody who knew what the local church pastor life was like, but also had this mind, this kind of could wander and study and be intentional about that, and was fantastic. So can you tell me more about that for you?
I think my interest in faith and education, and as I've shared that they've been two sides of the same story for me, is really wrapped up in what I call myself a Sankofa theologian. Many years ago, when I was an undergrad, actually at Drew, we talked about the ways in which college is so transformational. I traveled to Ghana, West Africa, the first time. I may have been about 19 or 20. And when I was traveling to Ghana, I was introduced to the term called Sankofa, which primarily means that in order to have a framework for understanding our present and to have a hopeful expectation for where we might be going in the future, we have to know from whence we've come. In other words, the past is present, as we've heard that cliche before, but the past certainly does matter. I believe that the past doesn't necessarily define where we go in God, but it also shapes how we answer the call of where we are going in God. And so my desire to learn about history, specifically my desire to go on and get many degrees and spend many hours of my life studying the past, has really been about learning that my call to education is not just for education for myself, but it really is about the ways in which education is so deeply empowering as we attempt to learn not only our own story, but the story of our neighbors, and to find ways in which, although we may be different culturally, or we may be differently because of a wide variety of human experience, that even in the context of our difference, we have some commonalities. And so my desire to learn more about others, to learn more about the African-American past, has certainly been a part of my journey. But it's also been about, well, God, what would you have me to do with the access to education that you've given me? So when I say faith and education, for me, has always been a part of the same coin, or two sides of the same coin. It's also been about a call to speak truth to power. The task of a historian is to look at the evidence laid before them and to come up with an interpretation. And unfortunately, sometimes, depending upon what narrative is being spun by the evidence or documents that are being viewed, there is a particular narrative that may be spoken about. And so when we speak truth to power, when we try to really do the work of hearing the voices and the stories of those whose narratives and stories don't make it in, a textbook, for example, we can learn more about others. And as we learn more about others, it gives us the capacity to hear the humanity and to see the humanity of others. So faith and education.
Oh, I love that.
Two sides of the same coin.
Well, and what I hear you articulating too is that takes great humility, and that should be a key and core part of our discipleship journey, is humbling ourselves to consider the needs and stories of others as better than our own, right? Like this is how we are sort of encouraged to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so I love how you're saying, look, the past informs our present, and part of understanding communities and peoples and neighbors and differences is going, how did we get here? How did we get here? And until we understand that, I think that's when we can really have those tangible, important steps toward justice forward, of like, how can we choose differently now? How can I live differently now? How can we restore some of these communities?
Yeah, I really appreciated what you said, based on how we know shapes on what we do now. And I like to say that when we know better, we can do better, right?
Absolutely.
And the past is always before us as we raise questions about how do we get here. But when we know better, we can certainly do better.
We can do better.
It's important to think about how we have arrived in the place where we are now. And knowledge does inform our forward faithful action as we move forward.
Faithful, yes. Yeah. Well, and so much of our American church, just in the context of American church, like we have inherited so much, right? So much that has happened, that has been passed down. And so, kind of as you said, it resonated with this kind of understanding of like the past still informs our present. And we understand, at least in our United Methodist belief, this like communion of saints and like the faithful from the past still inform and lead us today. But also the unfaithful from the past. And we've got to do that work and look sort of at the truth of our past, even as the American church, and the things that we've been complicit in.
Yeah, and it's not easy work. It is work that requires reconciliation. It is work that requires an honest look. And it is a work that is a work of conviction.
Yeah.
I was teaching my African American religions course on campus, actually on yesterday. And the topic was looking at the ways in which the Black church continued to evolve in the transition from enslavement through Reconstruction at the turn of the century. And I found myself quoting an often familiar quote that I quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. When my first teaching position at a small college in Augusta, Georgia, I taught like 4 history courses a semester. It was a lot of history. But I always use this line in teaching about the African American pursuit of equality, and that is that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And I believe that quote from W.E.B. Du Bois still rings true, that the ways in which we talk about being the beloved community, to use King's phrase, the ways in which we talk about being the church where everyone has room at the table. It's all about how we welcome each other. And sometimes we describe that as radical hospitality, but it is hospitality nonetheless. But when I was teaching or reminding and also sometimes introducing students to the shared witness of the Black church, especially as they made that transition from enslavement to freedom, really raised a question around how did the Black church center itself as a space, right? Both a physical and literal space. How did it center itself as a space of meeting the needs of local African Americans? How it centered itself as meeting the needs of being a place where African Americans begin to raise questions around what it meant to be a citizen in these United States of America, but also how the Black church has become, because of its shared witness and its commitment to justice and its commitment to equality, as a faith response, meaning with all that is happening in our community, in our neighborhood, in our world, the central mission of the Black church has remained the same. It has shaped and ebbed and flowed differently, but how do we do the just work of God? Not just justice, but how do we do the just work of God? And primarily, I'm helping students to see that the shared witness of the Black church is really the witness of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Can you tell us more about the theological emphasis, right, as a part of the Black church that we in pretty predominantly white spaces or non-Black spaces can learn from and to come to a better understanding, but also because I think we're telling the story, and it's important to know who's telling that story,
exactly,
and how intentionally we listen to that story, and we hopefully can learn to that process move forward. So what are some of those key theological emphasis or key events from history, whatever you want to land on there for us, that can allow us to see it?
Well, one, I invite you to enroll in one of my courses.
There we go.
I would love to. I was just thinking, I would love. Can you audit? Is that an option at LPT?
Well, I really don't know the answer to that question. We will certainly find out.
Okay, because I'm in town. I would love it.
Absolutely. But I will say that there's so many offerings that we'll be developing at the seminary for the Black Church Studies program in the next year or so. So there will be opportunities to participate in some of our continuing education programs and the like. But first, in response to your question, I want to say that there is no one monolithic Black church experience, but there are aspects of the Black church that connect people of African descent who are professing people of Christian faith. I'm going to speak specifically about the Black Christian church.
Sure.
But by and large, my own background is one where I grew up Baptist, and then I was ordained in a Pentecostal tradition called the Church of the Living God, having been founded by Mary Magdalena Tate. And as much as there are traditional Black faith traditions, African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, Church of God in Christ, National Baptist Convention. There's so many expressions of a Black Christian witness throughout the Black Church Universal. But even in that, there are some shared values as well. So a commitment to a liberation theology, the ways in which we believe in the justice, the divine justice of God. And that's so important when we think about the witness of the Black church. And I want to speak a little bit about the witness of the Black church, past and present. It's very familiar in terms of American history, and we think about the civil rights movement. And so often when we think about the civil rights movement, we think about predominantly African-American male clergymen, clergymen, I should say.
Yeah.
But the narrative of the Black church is both pastors, but it's also the lay people, men and women, and so many others, and children even, who have committed to being the voice, the feet, the heart of Jesus Christ out in the world. And so in many respects, when I think about just my own experience with the Black church, what inspires me the most is just a call to justice and a call to love, a commitment that when you trace any historical moment in the African-American pursuit of equality, the Black church has been a part of it. I think how the Black church has shown itself has ebbed and flowed, but the Black church has been a part of all movements for justice, whether it is the anti-slavery movement, abolition, certainly the transition from slavery to freedom, the ways in which the Black church has been the center of action in the context of social justice struggles. And while I'm on it, let me make a plug. We have our upcoming conference sponsored by Louisville Seminary and the Black Church Studies program. The theme for the Black Church Studies consultation this year is Call and Response, the Black Church at the intersection of faith and action. So as I've been sharing even in our time together today, it really is understanding that the Black church has always been at the intersection of faith and action, whether or not, again, we're talking about the story of African Americans making that transition from slavery to freedom, while we're also talking about the ways in which the Black church was at the center of the civil rights movement. There is so much involvement. And even today, the consultation conference that we'll be having starting next week, we'll be raising the question around what is the faith response that Black churches are being called to in this season, given the context of everything that's happening in our world, locally, nationally, and globally. And it's not just a question for the Black church, really. It is a question for all of us that what is our faith response today? I think the calling of a Black Church Studies program at Louisville Theological Seminary is to lift up the witness of the Black Church Studies program in particular, but to lift up the witness of African American churches and congregants and people as they have expressed their faith in matters of justice. In addition, you don't have to be of African descent to learn about the witness of the Black church, right? And so I believe that for my students, for partners who are raising questions around how they can learn about Christian history more broadly, that we can learn the ways in which the church of God goes beyond boundaries and goes beyond borders, goes beyond denominationalism, and that wherever the full people of God are, the Spirit of the Lord is.
That's right. That'll preach right there. Oh gosh.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main things that especially white pastors and predominantly white spaces should be learning from our Black church counterparts and leaders of like a long, faithful history of holding these two together, faith and action. Because I think oftentimes, especially, and you can trace it back to maybe some of the great awakenings or the sense of revival where there was a sense on this, kind of focus on the individual experience of salvation, right? And kind of this very internal experience of faith, that it's just about me and God, me and Jesus, we're good. And what we see, and especially with these mega churches and just the white evangelical movement, I mean, there's a separation out of this is an individual faith experience. And so then when you try to talk about, putting that into action or social justice or, there's all kinds of names that folks in this camp come up with to describe folks in this camp, right?
And we can have a whole conversation about
oh my goodness, absolutely. Right. But those two things go together. Like it's faith without works, right? I mean, these two things go together. It's how we love our neighbor. And I think, I grew up United Methodist. I've mostly led and been around predominantly white spaces in church. And so I think this is Rachel speaking from my experience of like, I think that's the main thing that we can learn as white leaders of like the faithful witness of how the Black church leaders have hold those two together.
Absolutely.
And the resilience of that, right? Of just.
And I think it also requires that we get out of our context, right? So as I was going through my journey at Columbia Theological Seminary, I answered the call of God to serve in the context of the Presbyterian Church USA. Context of Christian ministry unfamiliar to me.
Sure.
And field education is one of those powerful, transformative experiences. And I did one of my field ed experiences at a predominantly white, historic Presbyterian Church in the greater Georgia area. I'll say that. But in that congregation, I wasn't the first field ed student of African descent, but I was one of the first. But even in that context, some parishioners didn't know about the broader history and witness of African American Presbyterians. And for me, that was my first time sharing in worship leadership in a predominantly white, non-Black Christian church, and I was a bit nervous. And, given that I was also a student, I sometimes had the opportunities to preach in congregations connected to the seminary in different parts of Georgia. And so it was a deeply humbling and also transformative experience to be in a place of sharing the gospel to people who did not look like me. Because in that moment, I began to raise questions around, well, God, how is the gospel called to go beyond boundaries of difference of all kind, right? And how is the preached word that God gives me connecting with the people that I've been called to shepherd, even if I'm just shepherding them for an hour and 15 minute worship service. But I think it's so powerful and so very important that we get out of our context of ministry, as much as we encourage our youth classes to attend other congregations. When I was pastoring at 15th Street Presbyterian Church, one of my greatest joys was to have a visiting youth group who were on their confirmation journey. And they came and they did exactly what we have been talking about, learning about the Christian witness of people of color and other congregations and other faith traditions, because it expands our scope of seeing the handiwork of God in places that are unfamiliar, but also deeply connected. When we learn that we are not the only congregation that's going through a struggle because we're trying to figure out life beyond or within still a pandemic of many kind. When we are able to see the humanity in the justice struggles that other congregations have committed themselves to, then we can see that there's a call of God, that there's a just work that goes bigger and broader than just the work that we're doing. And we also realize that even in the congregations, in the ministries or the hospitals that we're serving in, that we are not in this work by ourselves. Yes, we trust that the power of the Holy Spirit, I trust that the power of the Holy Spirit, that Jesus Christ Emmanuel has gone on ahead of me. But even in that there are people who are committed to the liberating, transformative love of Jesus Christ who are also doing the work. And how much more impactful would our service be if we can get out of our context of ministry, connect and serve with others.
And do it together. And this is a time in our history where we need to be aware of the more people who are doing that, you know, and coming together because there's power in that gathering.
And I think as I can, in some ways, just share some advice, maybe even
please.
For congregations of any particular racial demographic or other kind of diverse background who answering the call to how can they engage in more works of justice, or how can they engage in becoming collaborative across boundaries that normally separate us, that we've heard in the past. And I don't even know if this cliche is still floating around, that the most segregated hour throughout the week is Sunday morning at what time? At 11 a.m. And I think that probably has some resonance to it, in that we tend to worship with what is considered part of our normative experiences of being. But congregations can partner together and hear each other's story of being and becoming the church of God. Congregations can come together in the same neighborhood even, right? That sometimes we are separated just because that congregation is Baptist and that congregation is Presbyterian and that congregation is non-denominational, but we're in the same neighborhood at times and we are called to do the same work, but we have not even bridged the gap of being neighbors in the same neighborhood.
Proximity.
Right? And so I think partnering with a historic African-American Methodist church in your own neighborhood, and especially when, I forget what the Methodists call it, when you come together for your we call them Presbyterian.
Holy conferencing.
Holy conferences. And, the conference should not only be the only space of gathering, and it shouldn't be the only time that you're having conversation with someone who is serving God, who's different than you.
That's right.
But to really engage the conferences as spaces where you're being intentional about building relationships and building bridges. And then think about what are the church programs that we have sponsored in our congregations, and how might that be an invitation to do the work of justice, to do the work of reconciliation. Perhaps invite a Louisville Seminary faculty member to come and share. But also perhaps invite when I was pastoring in South Carolina, I love revival season, but separate from revival season, I love the opportunity to swap pulpits. And in the swapping pulpits, I found myself preaching in some rural places all over South Carolina, places I never would have envisioned that my call would have taken me. But anytime I go into any context of ministry, I do what I used to tell my Phil Ed students to do your contextual analysis, learn a little bit about the context of ministry where you've been called to preach or serve. But it is daring to take a moment to learn about the place of ministry and the place of call that others are inhabiting and serving. We'll find more commonality sometimes than we realize we will.
I'm into that. The phrase that stuck out to me, it means so many, but being intentional. It takes that intentionality. And I think I've heard recently that Louisville is still one of the most segregated cities in the nation. And there are so many different peoples and cultures and immigrant communities. And I mean, my kid goes to public school and he's got kids that speak all kinds of different languages in his class. And that's a beautiful thing. And yet he still operates and engages in predominantly white spaces outside of school, right? Absolutely. And so it takes that intentionality. We could also go into a whole conversation of why the city is sorted the way that it is, right? A lot of systemic racism there. But it takes that intentionality of getting out of our comfort zones.
And as we know, the church is not just a building. The way in which I started February, which we know as Black History Month, the way that I started February was I was invited by alumnus of the seminary to join her for a reading experience. And the reading is an African-American kind of program where we acknowledge the history and witness and writings of African-American authors, and we basically read together in places of the church and schools. Anyway, I had the opportunity to read to kindergarten students and first grade students, and I read the first class. I was reading a story on Coretta Scott King, and it's one thing to teach theology and history to graduate adult students, but to talk about ministry and theology and history to graduate students, but to talk about history to kindergartners, I said, I have to think about this the next time I go.
They have a lot of questions.
But it was so very profound. I didn't know anything about the neighborhood. I'm new to Louisville. I've been here about 7.5 months, not that I'm counting. But the class was much more diverse than I realized. But even in that, it made me very mindful that in a history not too long ago, not even quite 60, 70 years, maybe about 60, 70 years ago, that our classrooms were very segregated spaces. And there still is a norm in some parts of our country. Yeah. But even in that, it takes intentionality. So the church is everywhere where the full people of God are. Amen. So getting beyond our context and being in community is eye-opening when we experience face-to-face the realities that our city is facing and the realities that our nation is facing, and certainly the realities that sometimes we only see that others are facing who live beyond our borders, and we only see it on the news. But it does require that we understand the importance of getting beyond our context and knowing that the work of the Holy Spirit is everywhere. Subsequently, I had the opportunity around this time, March of last year, to travel to Ghana again. And there probably was about at least a 24, 25-year time span between both of my visits. And so I was able to visit places like Accra, Ghana, and the monuments that remember the enslavement era, the slave castles on the west coast of Ghana, Elmina, and Cape Coast, if you've ever been, for anyone who may be listening later. And in viewing my experience again, and over that two-decade experience, I was still mindful that God is still here and that there are people of faith who are still living out there called to serve God, even in Ghana, West Africa, and other places where I've had the opportunity to visit. So I always look for the work that God is up to wherever I'm going. And I always look for what might be the opportunity to serve in ways that push me beyond my comfort zone, and opportunities to serve, even coming to be on a podcast and sharing faith and space and story with the both of you and our viewers who will be watching later. It really is a start to a conversation. And really, at the end of the day, what is theology? Is talking about God and community.
Oh, yeah.
Amen to that.
It's wonderful to go to seminary. Certainly do that if you feel called. That's right. Yeah, when I was in seminary, one of my field ed experiences was an internship at a senior retirement apartment community. And I developed a weekly, wasn't even a Bible study, but it was just weekly gathering of residents that lived there, and it was called God Talk. Okay. And what was really profound is that it was intergenerational. And I thought I would come in and have a whole lot to talk about God with the residents there. But they had been reading the Bible longer than I had been on earth. And some of them were African-American, white, Hispanic. It was a beautiful, diverse conversation. But even in that, I began to become more of a listener than the person convened to teach and facilitate the conversation, because so many of them spent their lives reflecting on how their faith has propelled them throughout their journey. And subsequently, I began my day in devotion thinking about a beloved member who had passed on from one of the congregations, actually two congregations. In a matter of a week, the two of the four congregations I pastored have lost members, and I'm looking at my schedule. Can I get and go back to the funeral? But as I sat with the remembrance of their lives, both of them actually were 95. Wow. But as I sat with the remembrance of their lives, I began to think about one of which I'm going to fly back and do a eulogy for. Oh, when was this person born? 95 years ago. What was happening in the world? And, we use this term among lifelong Presbyterian, I'll say it that way. But to know that they had served God through faith and belief. They were born in the Presbyterian Church, so they had no choice but to learn about the Presbyterian Church, but came to faith. But in so doing, they served in this particular congregation for 95 years, and that they were a school teacher. They're active in the local civil rights movement, was active in writing signs to businesses that were segregated. And so they had a faith response to their lives. And their work wasn't only confined by what they did as a Christian educator, as a Sunday school teacher, but their life of faith was how they embodied the liberating witness that the shared congregation believed in and professed. And so as I think about the ongoing call of the Black church, it is to be a liberating witness to the love of God wherever people of African descent who profess Christ find themselves. And so in talking about the Black Christian church, that is. And so it's important to know that a lot of what we shared is learning a little bit from our conversation today about the witness and mission of the Black church. But it's also an opportunity to think about how does what I profess and believe about Christ shape what I do today?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not just confined by our experience of worship on Sunday morning.
Embodying the liberating witness. Is that what we said? Embodying the
liberating witness embodying the liberating love of Jesus Christ.
Liberating love of Jesus Christ.
More specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I know we've touched on sort of several things that church leaders more broadly can be doing sort of to work toward this work of reconciliation and bringing these communities together. Is there any other tangible step that you might add to encourage pastors and church leaders more broadly, a tangible step toward that work of justice? I mean, you mentioned pulpit swaps. You mentioned kind of getting to know other churches in your neighborhood and doing stuff together, holding these events, being intentional, getting out of your comfort zones. Is there any other tangible step?
So a lot of what I have shared can be summed up in learning about the scope of opportunities to serve beyond your current context through collaboration, through learning about the history and witness of other cultures connected to your neighborhood and places that you're serving in.
Okay.
But I also think it's important to think about how we are stewarding resources that have been given to us, right? How are we stewarding resources? How can the building that your local congregation is inhabited in, and how can that be a resource to be a witness, to provide ministry of comforts and care to those in your neighborhood? How can we think intentionally about the fiscal resources that we have in the context of our congregation? What might be the mission moment that God is calling us to, connected to the work that we do every day in our congregation and also beyond? But it's not just about fiscal resources. It's also about encouraging congregation members to be present. A ministry of presence goes a long way. But sometimes before you can do the ministry of presence, you also have to do your own work about learning about what your own complicity may have been in moments of injustice, because all of our congregations are steeped in a past story of some kind.
Yes.
That's right.
Sometimes we can't even think about what's happening outside of our own doors because we haven't wrestled with our own complicity as a congregation and our own individual selves. So it is important to be attentive to what have we done in the past, and how might God be calling us to do it differently. Tradition is very important. As I'm a historian, I have learned and grown and worked and served in historic congregations. But sometimes we have to be mindful of the ways in which our tradition keeps us as a very insular focused congregation or ministry context. So being very mindful that the mission of God goes beyond the doors of our church.
That's right.
And that requires work of us. It requires perhaps having an opportunity to bring in a speaker to teach on a Bible study topic that our congregation is unfamiliar with. Maybe it might mean individually getting in a car and showing up someplace differently in your expression of worship on any given Sunday. It might be inviting someone to have coffee and conversation as a starting point for understanding.
Yeah.
And maybe understanding can then lead to reconciliation, but sometimes we are not even just kind of having the conversation.
Yeah.
So I invite all of us to continue the conversation so that we can continue to do the work of justice.
Yeah. I love seeing... I did a pulpit swap with a Louisville alum, a Louisville Seminary alum, John Randolph.
Oh, yes. I preached there about 3 weeks ago.
Okay. Lovely congregation.
Yes, lovely
and we did a swap, and that was really interesting part for me. I've never done that before, and that was outside of my comfort zone. And having Pastor Randolph come here and preach, and it was just a fantastic, we've created a good friendship before that, and then did that, and then now discerning what next part. But one of the most beautiful stories for me that I'll take with me is after the swap, some of my folks, and they're at a predominantly white, predominantly old retired, predominantly women small group, right? Yeah. And they were like, "Hey, Pastor, we think we're going to go surprise Pastor Randolph and show up on a Sunday morning. Is that okay?" And I was like, please do it. It's like not initiated by me. And so this group of women show up at Genesis down there in the West End. And for me, it was like, I didn't plan that. I didn't initiate that. They came up to me asking, "Pastor, is this okay?" And just to have that, now they start to ask good questions. Because they have a certain shared experience with folks. They start to, when some policies were happening in the city, they would ask, well, what do you think Pastor Randolph thinks about this? Well, I think we should ask him. You know, and so that opened and broadened because of experience alongside that. What I thought, pulpit swap, how much good will that actually do? Well, this relational building has actually been a beautiful bridge for us.
Absolutely. And I think the key word that you just mentioned is relational building. But before we wrap up, I wanted to mention that I heard in you sharing that story, both fear and love.
Yes.
And that is that sometimes we need to feel that hospitality is there before we will go and visit another congregation or extend an opportunity to share a meal. But it does take bravery and it does take courage. On the other side of that, we, the church, must be prepared to receive who God sends, right?
That's
and so it's fear on both sides, but it also can be love and acceptance on both sides as well. That as much as we want to say that we are a open church, but are we really? And so what does that look like, not just in signs and symbols, but in relational welcome and acts of hospitality?
Yeah, that's good.
So it's very, very important. And so that's a good place to reflect upon.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Well, this has been such a great conversation for me personally, and I know. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Yes, I've enjoyed, and I hope to come back again.
That's right. Oh, you'll be invited again. And we'll also put in the show notes information about LPTS, about the Black Church Studies consultation coming up, and any ways that they can find more information about you.
Upcoming continuing education events, I might have heard.
Sign
I will be listening for.
And we have so many deeply impactful new endeavors coming up at the seminary. So
that's exciting.
More to come, but most information can be found just by visiting our seminary website. So.
That's right. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Well, we have one last portion for you, and this is kind of what we call the Holy Roast. And so we'll be going through kind of quick fire questions, and so first response that comes to your mind that you want to share. So we'll see what happens. What are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? Have You Got Good Religion by Anne Marie Mingo, by Reverend Dr. Anne Marie Mingo. She's our Edwards lecturer, a named lecturer, part of the Black Church Studies consultation. I'm rereading it as I prepare for her visit and lecture on this coming Thursday.
Okay, we'll link that one too. What is one thing on your bucket list that you haven't done yet?
Locally, I have not yet been to the Muhammad Ali Museum, so I'm actually going to have the opportunity to go tomorrow. So I wanted to do that before Black History Month, February, comes to a close. So not necessarily a lifelong bucket list, but there are things locally in Louisville that I have not yet experienced and I'm looking forward to.
Yes, that's awesome. What is your favorite city in the United States besides the one you live in? So you can't name Louisville, although it is great. Other
7 months here. I'm sure it's your favorite.
I will have to say that Washington, D.C. has become my favorite city, particularly because so much of who I am, I experience being energized by my love for museums, the African American Smithsonian. And although there's so many museums that I didn't even visit, although I lived there for 7 years, but the historicity of the place, and there's a beloved congregation there that I pastored. But it's a walkable city. I ran my first half marathon in Washington, D.C., so it is a place near and dear to my heart, and I would literally run around all the monuments and all of the other places in D.C. I'll say that, and praying. I would pray for the leaders of our nation, the leaders in our churches, and I would pray for our country. And so Washington, D.C. has a very special and fond memory in my heart. But I'm also coming to love Louisville as well.
That's right. What is your favorite movie to quote? So if there's a movie that you go to over and over again that you'd say, this just comes off,
favorite movie to quote. There's not one jumping up right now, but partly because I've been kind of talking about it a whole lot, and that's The Color Purple.
Sure.
The Color Purple is, check it out when you have a chance.
That's right. That's right. Last one.
Okay.
You're called up to bat. It's time to hit the ball. You're in Major League Baseball right here. What's your walk-up song?
What's my walk-up song?
Your pump-up song.
A pump-up song. Well, what gets me going when I'm running? So I'll use that metaphor.
That's fine.
Yes.
Yep.
Is the Rocky song.
Okay.
Nice.
I was singing. No.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, just like the Rocky song really kind of gets me going.
Did you going up and down the monuments while that song's playing?
Yeah. This just gets me really pumped as I'm preparing for my next race.
There we go.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love that. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a delight and opportunity to model what we've been talking about today.
That's right.
To come and be a part of the conversation. Transformation happens as we overcome and share from our testimonies and witness.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Yeah.
And blessing upon this ministry of your shared work together. Deeply impactful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Praylow.
Thank you so much. All right.
Okay.